All right, so tonight our speaker is Amanda, and she is a professional landscape architect at PlanIt Landscape Perspectives, and she is also an adjunct faculty member in the horticulture department at the College of DuPage. Amanda received her bachelor's in landscape architecture from Ball State University. In addition to being a professional landscape architect, she is also a LEED and Sites certified professional. And Amanda plays in the dirt, a phrase her great grandmother used to describe her, reflects Amanda's passion of nature and gardening. She loves the outdoors and traveling, and she's always creating. And so now I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here this evening. It's a beautiful, strange, but wonderful spring day in the Midwest. So it's great to talk about rain gardens and plants and green things because tomorrow is going to be cold and windy and rainy again. So thank you all for joining me tonight on this really nice evening where you could be outside sitting and enjoying the last few moments before it gets chilly again. Like Wendy said, my name is Amanda Arnold. I am a landscape architect. I've been working now in the industry for I don't know, about 14 years, but I have been gardening since I could walk. My great-grandmother said it perfectly. I love to play in the dirt, and I always have. So when we talk about rain gardens, that's exactly what we're talking about. And it just starts with a drop. So let's dive in. I like to outline some learning objectives. Rain gardens are kind of an interesting animal. They are particular. They have a certain structure. They need a proper location. They need a certain size, and then you need to have fun with it. We were kind of having some early conversations before we got started tonight, saying that it's always changing. We know our landscape is always changing. We have beautiful gardens. I'm sure all of you like to play outside in your gardens, and you know from year to year things change, whether it's weather, whether it's Mother Nature, whether it's just age as the garden matures and changes and does different things. But rain gardens really have to have that touch because we never know what Mother Nature is going to give us. Some years we may have a lot of rain, some years we may have drought. And now we're changing even more. We used to size our rain gardens for like 1 inch, and now we're sizing them for 2 or even 3 inches. So it's really kind of fun to watch this evolution of rain gardens over time. So let's dive into the first thing we need to talk about. Use your resources. There are so many really cool books, and I actually picked my 3 favorites here to talk about rain gardens. There's so many things that say you can do this and you can do that. But look at examples, look at case studies. Rain gardens are weird and they're kind of fun. And they do different things and everybody's is unique. So it's really fun to look at different rain gardens, see what different people have in their yards, look in different books. All 3 of these books are really excellent as far as understanding, and they have a lot of good examples. This one's probably
Amanda,
a little... Yeah,
Amanda, we're still on the first slide.
Oh, do you still see it? You're not looking at this. Let me try to share again. We'll start again. All right, there we go. Now can we see the second slide?
Smarter, not harder.
Yes. All right.
That's better.
There's always some technical difficulty that happens. So these are some beautiful resources, some of my favorites. Creating Rain Gardens really gets into the nuts and bolts of things. The Rain Garden Sustainable Landscaping is wonderful because it shows a lot of case studies. And then just plain rain gardens, managing water sustainably is a really nice because it's a balance of both public and residential and the pros and cons and things that went wrong and things that went right. So it's really kind of fun to dive into that. Utilize others with skill. This may include your kids or your grandkids. Help them let you dig. It's really fun to do that, but make it fun and solve a problem. Rain gardens is about where does our water go? We know it has to go somewhere. And we live in the suburbs and we just think, oh, we built these beautiful places and we have these gardens, but the water always wants to take the path of least resistance. So let's let it, and let's create a rain garden in that space. So the proper location. So this is huge. Where do you put it? You want to do where water drains but doesn't hold. This is a common mistake that people have. They're thinking, oh, I want to put it in the lowest area of my yard. Water always stands there. That's where my rain garden is. Well, that can be a solution. That may be something you have to work around, but you want to put it in a place that it's going to collect as much impervious surface water as possible, but you also don't want it to just stand there and be stagnant, because then your rain garden won't be managed properly. Now, when we talk into the next section about preparing your soil and the soil mixtures, you can amend some of that. But you need to make sure that you're not having excess water standing. The purpose of a rain garden is to not have mosquitoes and not have liabilities. It's to make sure that water comes and goes, and it does its job with the native plants that you put in it. So the biggest thing too is to remember it needs to be a minimum of 10 to 15 feet away from your home. You don't want to recycle that water right back into your sump line, right next to your foundation. It's going to do what it does. It's going to go right back into the soil, and it's going to just keep recycling back towards your house. So making sure you keep it at least 10 to 15 feet away from your home. Also consider utilities, trees, things like that, easements, setbacks, all those fun things that we don't want to think about. You can do rain gardens in easements in most villages. They don't have a problem with that because you're usually managing water, but you do need to be aware of if those utilities are utilizing those easements, if they ever need to be dug up and replaced. So making sure you're considering that.
If my ex finds out I violated the visitation order, she'll make it so I can never see him again.
Your ex lives in the Bronx.
She stays with her boyfriend.
I think we have some background noise. So consider the world around you. You're not an island. This is also what people forget to think about. They're like, oh, I have this water coming from my roof, and I have this water coming from my driveway. But you have to remember that you're not an island. Look at the larger neighborhood. Are you at the bottom of your street? Are you at the top of your street? Does your neighbor's yard empty into yours? Do you empty into your neighbor's yard? So making sure you're understanding the directions. You're not just this island, and you're not just collecting your water. You may be collecting others, or you may be dumping on others. So you need to make sure you know where exactly that location is. So the basics. It's simple. We're looking at water. That's the number one goal. Where does the water go and how do we do with it? But you're also looking at the flowers. That's the fun part of it all. And how are we going to use that space? Is it something that you're going to see? Is it something that you're going to interact with? Is it close to your house? Is it further away from your house? And what function is it actually producing? This is the one we most commonly forget, is function. Why are we doing this rain garden? It's not just to get rid of surface water. It's to direct water in a certain direction. It's to deal with, you're adding a feature to your home, you're adding an addition to your house, you're adding a patio. What is it functioning as? So that's a really important question. Most people get the water part. Most people get, oh, I want some really cool flowers, and I'm going to use it because I'm using it as a space to empty out my water, and I'm using it as a space for pollinators. But they forget about the function part of it. What is it doing? Is it just helping the groundwater table? Is it dealing with surface runoff, or are you dealing with surface cover? You're trying to solve some of those problems. So making sure that you're understanding the function of why you're doing what you're doing is really important. And then understanding location. So we talked about trees, we talked about proximity, utilities, some of those fun things. And the biggest thing is slope. So I love the string and stake method. It's something I always used as a kid. It was always fun to stick a stake in the ground and have a little rock tied to the end and throw it down the hill and kind of figure out what the slope is. But when you're talking about rain gardens, you need to really consider your slope. If it's 4% or less, that's what most of us have in our suburban homes, then you really need a 4-inch deep rain garden. Now, granted, this is a rule of thumb, so it's not every place is going to be different. If you've got 5 to 7%, you're looking at a 6-inch, 8 to 12 is 8-inch, and then anything greater than 12, you really need to find another location because you're just not going to be able to keep water where it needs to be to give it enough time to percolate through that soil. And as I'm talking through all this, if you guys have questions, please feel free to interrupt. I'll take a couple pauses through my presentation, and we can have some kind of question and answer time. I don't like just talking to a screen. I like interacting with all of you. So, but slope is really important. People forget about that. And it really determines the depth because you need to understand how that water is going to move through your rain garden. And I love this diagram here because this is how the slope is before the digging. Here how it is after the digging. And you know kind of where you are to make sure you have that berm to hold the water in long enough before you have the overflow. And this is what a lot of people forget about. You have to keep the water in there long enough to do what it needs to do, but still have a place for it to escape. So soil infiltration, this is my favorite thing to do. You dig a hole and you throw a bunch of water in it and you see how fast it stays in there. If it stays, flows, or goes. This is one of my favorite things to do. One of my favorite examples is I had a wonderful client that I worked with several years ago in Winfield, and a wonderful house. She had beautiful landscape, but the backyard, there was just a section that wouldn't do anything. And I looked at it, I'm like, it's really heavy clay. There's some compaction here from when you did construction. I said, let's do an infiltration test. So I dug a hole. It took almost 48 hours for the water to even go down like an inch. That's how compacted her soil was. It was so sad. So we had to do massive soil amending for her house. But sometimes you dig a hole and it's gone in like, an hour or two. That means you've got great soil and you definitely have an idea of what you can do. So let it drain completely. Let it go all the way to the bottom. Less than 6 is pretty functional. You don't have to amend the soils that much. When you start getting in the 18 to 24, try again. So try a different location. Look at what you need to do to amend. But 6 to 18 hours is a pretty good infiltration rate. You do need to do some amendments if you're getting towards that 18. And that really helps people. A lot of people think, oh, if I have a rain garden, I have to amend the soils right away. Some of us have the luxury of we live on great lots in this area where the soil hasn't been compacted so much over the years, or you've lived in your home for 30 or 40 years. You might have some good soil out there, and we don't need to completely amend the soil if you're having some good infiltration. You might actually amend it too much, and then it's not going to stay long enough to keep your rain garden plants happy. So it's important to do the infiltration test. It's fun to dig an 18-inch hole and see what happens. So you can use a ruler, you can figure it out. You can do, it's just rate of water in the hole divided by time, inches per hour. So it's pretty easy to figure out. So you just need to figure out where you're at and what does. Clay can drain. People just think, oh, I can't have a rain garden. I have to just dig out all the soil and try again. Clay drains. It drains beautifully. It's our native soil. It does well, but you have to do those tests to find out. And definitely, if you have new construction, you definitely want to rough it up and see where the compaction is on your home. That's a huge thing that people forget about. You may have great topsoil and you may have great soil going on, but it's just been compacted for some reason, whether it's construction or it's an old driveway. I've had people tear up driveways and do stuff. You've got to get rid of that compaction and then try your soil infiltration test again and see what that soil is actually doing, the actual soil composition. So sizing your rain garden. This is really important when you're talking about goals. The depth is one thing, but then when you talk about, if I actually go back to this method, when we're talking about our slope, this is where you get your sizing as far as your depth. So you know you're either doing 4, 6, 8 or something greater than that. But when we're talking about our sizing, we're talking about how wide we need to go. So people always think, oh, I can just make it smaller and dig it deeper. No, that's not going to work for you most of the time. You won't be achieving those goals that you're looking for. So what do you do now? You know, you've got the right location. You know what you're doing. What downspouts are you throwing in there? What surface water are you looking at? What do you need and want to direct in this space? So the reason why I put surface water twice is because how much is being drained into your space? Things that I like to use for that, sometimes I use the county GIS, and you can do a simple kind of polygon shape on top of your property and find out where the slope is. They have some great topography maps on there. Sometimes you can just look at Google Earth, or sometimes you can walk around your neighborhood and take a good guess just to see how much space is actually being drained to that particular location. And then where do you want it to go? Surface water has to be directed. It has to be directed between houses. It has to be directed around driveways and patios and all those fun things that we want to do. So where do we direct it? So not only how much, but where. And then very details. There's some great methods on sizing your rain garden. And I'm going to show you some quick, easy cheat sheets, but it can be very complex and detailed. We can dive into the nuts and bolts of engineering. And I have several books in my library where it's like this thick, and we can go into all the details on how you size a rain garden and go from there. Or you can do very simple calculations. There's some easy cheats and tricks that I can show you all tonight that kind of help you get through that initial calculations. So I know this is really wordy and I'm not going to go through it and read it all to you, but basically measure the footprint of your house. Length, width, height. We go back to that basic math, and then estimate length, width of the area that's draining. If you're collecting from your driveway or section of the road, just estimate it, and then divide this area by 6. Pretty simple, because if your garden is 6 inches deep, you're going to do a 6-inch. If you're going to divide it by 8, if it's 8 inches, and that kind of gives you the square feet needed for your rain garden. So it's pretty easy. You're looking at length and width, and then you're understanding whether it's your house, your driveways, your sections of road, parts of your garden or your landscape lawn, and then you're just dividing it by the depth. So that's like the cut and dry, easy way to do it. And then you can make it whatever shape you want. So this just gives a nice example of that. You've got, a big, and I'm not going to dive into the math, but your big square foot house. So this is 1,800 square feet. It's not within 10 feet of the foundation. And then they're just dividing it up into these 2 beautiful rain garden spaces that are each 75 square feet each. One's circular and one's kind of this cool kidney shape. So it's as simple as that, just taking your total square footage, dividing it by the depth of your garden and figuring out what that square footage needs to be. That's the quick and dirty, simple one. They also have this beautiful thing, and I know it's a design guide for Connecticut and New England, so I get it. It's not in our Midwestern area, but it's one of the best kind of self-help for us as residents that we could do. And you can't enter your address. It will look you up on Google Earth. So you can't enter your own address, even though we don't live in Connecticut or New England. But it can help you size your rain garden. It helps you go step by step, find your address, sizing it. You can draw little shapes on there. It's really easy, even for us that don't like computers like me. So it's nice. Granted, it'll tell you what plants to use, and they're from Connecticut, New England, so don't listen to the plant part, but it does help you size if you're looking for an easy way to kind of see your yard from a bigger picture and kind of know what's going on. So it doesn't match up completely because it's not our area, but I'm hoping we can get something like this in our area sometime, because it's a great guide to help local homeowners understand what's going on. But you can definitely look up your home and do it, because I did it myself and I really liked it. So. This is from the Rain Garden Alliance. If you've never looked them up, it's just raingardenalliance.org. It's a really great kind of, again, tool that you can use. How much rainfall you wanting to deal with in your garden. They go up to 3.5 inches. What surface area you're estimating, how many downspouts, what's your soil quality, and what's your slope. And it'll actually tell you, this is the depth of the garden, and this is how many gallons it'll capture in a rain event, number of plants you need, and then it gives you an approximate cost, which is a little out of date, but it still helps you with square footage, size, what you're actually doing for the environment, which is really cool, how many gallons you're actually capturing. So this is a really fun tool as well. And I've tried it from 3.5 inches to 1/2 inch, and it's really kind of fun to try it out and see what happens. So this is definitely a fun, easy tool to use. So any questions so far?
I had one, or a
Go for
comment
it.
maybe. What's the implication if your rain garden is either too small or too large compared to what the recommended amount is for the area you're draining? What will happen if your rain garden is too small?
So I have been on both sides of the wheel. I've made rain gardens too small. Early in my career, I didn't know what I was doing as much, and I wasn't as versed, and I worked with a wonderful contractor. He and I learned together, and we built this beautiful rain garden, and then we saw that after our big torrential rains that we have in the beautiful Midwest, after a 3-inch rain, it didn't do anything. everything. And in fact, it destroyed part of the rain garden. So I've learned since then. I've actually had ones that we've done oversized because the client thought they wanted a bigger space. And we had plant death. So if you undersize your rain garden, you're looking at parts of it to fail. So it's not just about, okay, the water runs off in a heavy rain. You might actually have soil erosion. You might actually have plants drown because they're sitting in water too long. You might actually have mosquito issues because you're having water standing for more than 24 hours, and your neighbors might not like you very much after that. So making it too small, if you're scared that it's too small, you can err on the side of caution of making it a little larger. That's what I usually tell homeowners. Problem is when you make it too large, then you're going to have plants dry out and you're going to be supplementing watering your rain garden, which is the totally opposite effect of what we want to do. So it really is important that you use some of these basic tools to guess, to come really close to those sizing methods, looking at your impervious surfaces, looking at your downspouts, figuring out those basic square footages. It's really important to try. It's better to go a little larger than smaller because it's better to have some of your plants dry out, and you can always transition to slightly drier natives. And we'll talk about that when we talk about designing. But you can always transition a little bit more and change that over time a little bit. And that is better than going smaller, because smaller just brings a whole lot more issues to the table. Although I've had people add on to their rain gardens and make a chain of rain gardens after the fact. That did work. They kind of created this cool water feature thing happening. Not purposely, it was something that they had to deal with the problem, but we did have to go back to the one client I was talking about, and we did have to dig a bigger rain garden. So a larger as far as wide. So always err on the side of going a little bit larger. Great question.
Thank you.
I think somebody was asking about sump pumps. Of course. You can definitely use sump pumps in rain gardens. That's a beautiful place to put your sump pump instead of emptying out on a sidewalk or a driveway, which is what a lot of people do. It's better to keep in your own yard and deal with the water there. The biggest thing about sump lines is you definitely want to make sure you're at least 15 feet away from the house, because you don't want any of that water percolating back and just making your sump pump keep running. That's not the goal. So you want to definitely keep the sump line away from a little bit further. I always tell people, if you're really dealing with a lot of water in your sump line, then keep it a little further away from the house. If your sump goes off occasionally, you could probably put it 10 feet away from the house and it would be okay. If your sump pump is running a lot and constantly, then you're going to take that water further away from the house as you possibly can. I just met with a wonderful client in Westchester. She's having the same problem. Her sump pump goes off constantly. In fact, she has 2 sump pumps and they go off almost all the time. So we basically made her entire front yard a rain garden, because that's how much water she's doing. But we got it as far away from the house as we possibly could before we started emptying that water out. So sump lines are great to utilize and get those away, but you want to make sure you're trying to distance them further away. Great questions. All right, so let's talk about designing. So when we talk about anything in landscape architecture, landscape design, we're talking about form, function, and beauty, the three main things, as I always call them. And first, we're talking about form. Utilize the lay of the land. Don't work smarter, not harder. Let's talk about using your resources, using what you have. Utilize the lay of the land. Don't try to build up something in your head and try to make more work for yourself. Do what Mother Nature's giving you. Use free-form shapes. Don't feel like it has to be a certain shape. Always protect your trees. The trees are helping that water situation. And if you stress them out by digging around them, you're actually going to cause more water problems in the long run. Like I said earlier, make it larger, not smaller, and fit it into the existing landscape. What is your landscape style? I've done other presentations about landscape style. It's a lot of fun to explore people's styles. But what is your style? You don't have to make it look completely different. You can fit into that. I've done rain gardens that are very formal looking because I've worked with landscapes that are more formal or more traditional or more colonial in style. I've done rain gardens that are very natural and wild, and it looks like we just threw a bunch of seeds in there and had a good time, but it has a design, it has a form. So play with what your landscape style is. You don't have to be this completely different thing because you think it has to be a rain garden. It can have a form, it can have a function, it can be very simple. It can have 4 or 5 plants in it. It doesn't have to have 20 plants in it that are all different. So you can play to your landscape style. And this is the one that everybody forgets about. How will it be viewed? When you're talking about form, a lot of people think, oh, it's just going to be viewed from multiple sides. So I can plant the tall stuff in the middle and I can plant the short stuff on the outside and it'll be cool that way. But a lot of times, some of our rain gardens are viewed one-sided. That sounds kind of silly, but a lot of times we're seeing it from either inside our house or from our driveway or from a patio. And it's actually more one-sided. So play to that. Don't hide plants on the backside that you never are going to see. So make sure you think about where it's going to be viewed from. That's really important. All right, so when we're talking about form and function, we're talking about now how does it work? So excavate soils, loosen soils. You want them to be loose and fluffy. And this is very typical, so everybody's soil is going to be a little different. That's why you do the infiltration test. But what's your typical mix? You want to mix a little bit of that top soil for the rain garden to be 50 to 60% sand, and you want 20 to 30% topsoil. You want it to be kind of low in clay, or people do the 30-30-30 method. So they have a little bit of compost, a little bit of topsoil, a little bit of sand, and just do 30-30-30. Because our clay does break up. When you kind of loosen it up, it does great things. And that's why our native plants love it. So you do want to mix a little bit of sand and a little bit of compost in there, but don't go heavy on the compost. You want to keep that on the lighter end, especially when we're utilizing native plants. Regrade. Utilize all that excavated soil. Regrade the area to assist in the rain garden form and function. Use what you have. Again, go with the lay of the land. You don't have to start things over from scratch. And then what do? The biggest question everybody has is, well, if I have a rain garden, do I put mulch on it? Or do I throw gravel in there? Or what do I do? The answer is yes and no. You have to have some kind of erosion control, especially when the plants are getting established. So you might need to put a little bit of leaf mulch in there for that first season, just to get everything kind of weighted down. You don't want to do traditional mulch at all. It's going to float, and you're going to see it float right down and away, or it's going to trap those overflow areas. So don't use traditional mulch, use a leaf mulch. Or if you do use a little bit of gravel, sometimes people use gravel on those escape routes or those traps. That helps. If you want to hold a little bit more moisture in, create little check dams, and we'll talk about that. So you may need select stones, especially at downspouts or on slopes, where you have that water just shoving itself into that space. You're going to cause, and when we have those down-wrenching rains, you might need some stones there to slow down the water a little bit so you don't have those erosion issues while the plants are getting established. Later on, you might move the stones around. You might not need them anymore, but you would definitely have to consider that the plants aren't magically going to grow in a day, as you all know. So making sure you have some of those thought processes in mind. So go ahead.
I just have a comment about mulching.
Yes.
When I created my rain garden, I found a product. Somebody might have referred me to getting it, but it's really basically shredded paper.
Yes.
And it was really nice to put, because when you're putting in all of these plants, you want to give them a little protection because it might not rain for a while.
Exactly.
And, you don't have the wood chips floating away. I thought that the shredded paper worked really well. And actually I have a paper shredder because I used to do a lot of printing in my job.
Mm-hmm.
And just have, a household paper shredder. So I sometimes use that when I'm putting in new plants.
Yes, that's a great comment. I don't know if I talk about that later or not, so I'm glad you brought it up.
All right.
Paper shredding. The only thing I recommend for paper shredding is making sure you're not putting, because most of our paper shredding, I don't know, everybody lives in different villages and cities, but like I can't recycle my shredded paper. Once it's shredded, they won't take it. So I use it in the garden because what else am I going to do with it? The only thing I caution with that is just make sure you're not putting anything that has staples. Not that it's going to hurt anything, but when you're weeding and digging, you might hurt your hand. So avoid staples, and then avoid anything that has a lot of dye in it. Usually print dye has no really like high intensity effect on soil composition or pH, but you just don't want to have a bunch of dye in there, any of that really slick and glossy paper, because it doesn't hold the moisture. So it's just not giving you benefit. If it's really saturated with dye, you're not getting any of that moisture retention that you're looking for. So unless you're putting it on vegetable gardens, then the dye can have a slightly effect on the pH, and it can affect your vegetables. It's not toxic in any way, because you're not eating it in large amounts or anything like that, but it's more about the moisture retention. So just avoid some of that really slick paper if you're shredding. But I always dump my shredding paper in my yard, because it's just better. What else am I going to do with it? Otherwise, I'm going to throw it in the trash can, and what's the point? So
Well, they do have some drives.
yeah,
Done some recycling events. So you can bring it, but
you can. I just like to just throw it in my yard.
I do too. Yeah.
You can even mix it in with a little compost, and it's a nice, or leaf mulch. I shred up leaf mulch and toss it in there. It really helps with that moisture retention. So
That's
great
good.
comment. Any other questions?
Amanda, that photo showed that yard being dug was in somebody's front yard.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, do you run into any sort of homeowners restrictions or
Yes.
village ordinances? You can't do that in your front yard. Everyone has a lawn.
Most of the villages are okay with it now. I'm not saying every village is, so please check with yours before you do it. But most are getting much more open to the idea, even just in the last 2 to 3 years. I've done a lot more front yard rain gardens than I ever thought I would, because most people are like, oh, can we do it in the backyard? Well, of course we can, but the front yard also has runoff as well. So many villages are more open to that idea because they're realizing the need for stormwater management, especially. And it also helps them because you don't have your sump line or your downspout going in the sewer and stormwater system. So it's not overloading their system. So most villages are starting to turn around to that. And that's when we talk really about designing. You want to make sure it's a little more designed, so you're not scaring your neighbors, or you're getting some of that tall stuff in the front. And that's when you run into some of your HOA situations where they're like, oh, you have like a, beautiful 4-foot tall Asclepias incarnata in your front yard. You need to cut that down because it's 4 foot tall and it's blocking the sidewalk. So you have to be careful with plant heights and things like that. That's probably the biggest thing when you talk about designing. But most villages are pretty open to starting to think about that differently. They don't always want you to hide it underground, because that is the other option. If you don't have a rain garden, what do? They make you dig a beautiful gravel pit underground, and then they cover it with turf on the top. Nobody likes to look at that. So that's the alternative. But I've seen it just in the past 2 to 3 years that more villages are being more open to it, especially if you give them a plan that shows I'm going to maintain height. It has a design structure. They're a little more open to accepting that.
Thanks.
Great question. So this is one of my favorite graphics, because when we think about rain gardens, we think, oh, it's wet, it's moist, I can plant all these beautiful wet plants in there. But you have to remember that it gets really dry on the sides. And I know that seems like very much common sense. But I even did that in my own rain garden when I was planting. I'm like, I don't have a sump pump, but my utility drains. So it's actually my utility room. So it's my washer, my dryer, my condensation from my furnace and things like that. And so I was like, oh, it stays wet like all the time. How cool. No, it doesn't. It does get dry on the edges. So making sure you have these transition zones. You have definitely the wet zone where things are going to be staying moist fairly regularly. And then you have things that are going to be kind of moderate. So you're transitioning from more of that, what we call wetland species, to non-wetland species. A lot of our rain gardens are more moderate, to be honest. Many of them we're planning for 2 to 3 inch rains. They're not always wet unless you really have a sump pump that runs constantly. They're more on the moderate side. We have beautiful Midwest weather that has periods of drought. And you don't want to be supplement watering your rain garden. So you might want to err on the side of doing a little bit more moderate plantings, even in the middle. And then doing, of course, dry plantings on the side, because you don't want to have to water again. As you get towards the top too, you can see this, the diagram is wonderful with this. You're going from, this is an 8-inch depth rain garden, and you're going all the way up to a little bit of a 3. So even in a light rain, these drier plants are going to get watered, so you're not going to have to supplement. They're going to get their natural watering cycle. And then the rest of the runoff is going to drain into the middle portion. So you definitely want to have those sloped sides. But always look at that. See how much water you're really looking at, because you might start, when we start talking about picking out plants, you might want to start with more moderate plants. And then as you watch your rain garden grow and develop, you might say, oh, well, this corner of the rain garden stays a little wet more often. Maybe I could plant something that's more wetland there. So really pay attention to what your rain garden is saying to you, because it might say, oh, I can't handle the wet plants, or I need it all to be wet plants. This is something I'm sure that you all know very much and enjoy, but these are our beautiful non-natives and these are our natives. So they have these beautiful depth of root systems. But this is the fun part. We're looking at wetland edge plants. We're not necessarily looking at wetland plants. We're looking at more wetland edge. So those are the moderates. And then you have to pay attention. Is it sun, partial sun, or is it really shade? You can do rain gardens in the shade, I promise. It can be done. And then what aesthetics are you looking for? Is it in the front yard? Do you really want it to be more formal? Is it structured? Or is it a little more natural and wild? And then what are your goals? Are you looking for a certain color scheme? Are you looking for more of textures? Are you looking for heights to maybe block something? You still go back to the basic design principles. What are you trying to accomplish with this space besides doing the function part of the water? So this is one of my favorite things. It's the Conservation at Home Build Your Own Rain Garden Guide. It's a great kind of starter kit of here's sample rain garden plants of all shapes and sizes. And these are some of my favorites, and they do well in most rain gardens. A lot of these are that they're showing on this page can go to that moderate side. So you're not thinking of something that's super moisture loving. There's a few on here, like your blue flag iris tends to like a little bit more moisture. But most of these, prairie dropseed, it loves being dry. It could be dry or moist. So you've got some really great choices here as far as things that can be on that border. So. As far as that goes. So everything's a little bit here. We've got some beautiful, your wild geraniums, they can do a little bit more partial sun, a little bit more shade. So you've got some really nice choices here as far as your zigzag goldenrod, one of my favorites. People totally need to use this one more. It can handle a little more shade. So you've got a nice mixture. Unfortunately, on this layout, it doesn't say sunshade, moist, wet, but these are some really great kind of all-inclusive plants that most rain gardens will be fairly happy with. So I love this brochure, and you can definitely find this on their website as well. And this is kind of what's on the inside, and I love this that they do, here's like zone B, here's the dryer, and here's the wet, and they kind of divide it out for you. And then they give you some shaded options as well. So it kind of goes through the simple process. Make it simple. Go through that, looking at natives and native cultivars and all that fun stuff. You may have to use some cultivars. I always like to say go native if you possibly can. But if you're talking about a front yard rain garden, you might need to use the cultivar of Joe Pyeweed. You may not be able to have an 8-foot Joe Pyeweed in your front yard, but a Joe Pyeweed is a beautiful pollinator plant and it's a beautiful rain garden plant. So go with the cultivar, but try to stay true to those natural native straight species. They're going to do better in a rain garden situation. So always go with the tried and true before you switch to the cultivar. In my rain garden, the only cultivar I have is the Joe Pyeweed because I absolutely love it, but I couldn't have an 8-foot Joe Pyeweed in my rain garden. So I have the cultivar, which is the little Joe, and I love it. And it fits in beautiful with my goldenrod. It flows all together and it does a great job. So making sure you understand what you need to do and when is really important as far as the cultivars and staying with the straight species. So these are some beautiful outlines. These are actually from the Farmer's Almanac, believe it or not. One of my favorite places to go. I've been looking at the Farmer's Almanac since I was little, and I always thought it's really fun to find out things that are past and things that are future. Nature changes, but some of the things she does the same. So these are great little diagrams to show you can do shrubs. Shrubs are great for rain gardens. People forget that. They're like, oh, I just want to put these beautiful flowers in there. Shrubs are really cool in rain gardens too. They give you that winter texture. They give you that extra boost of flavor. They bring birds more into your habitat. So having shrubs in there is really fun. And I love, the reason why I love this one is because I mentioned blueberries, which I think is really fun to have in your rain garden. So don't be afraid to look at some of our beautiful native shrubs. They're really nice to have in there. And as far as planting those as a part of the whole, especially if you have the space to do it. So these are some of my favorites. You've got, of course, everybody knows butterfly weed and all those fun things. One of my favorites that people forget about in rain gardens is the lobelia, the blue cardinal flower. A little easier to grow than actual cardinal flowers. Some people have great success with cardinal flower. Other people fail miserably. I fail miserably. I can't get it to grow anywhere, but I can get the blue cardinal flower to grow just beautifully. And I love it. So look at those different options. There's some really fun things out there as far as with the sun. But people forget that we also have shady areas, and we have a lot of shady areas that are moist. And what can we do there? Again, there's some beautiful options with trees and shrubs. We can talk about the arrowwood viburnum, and we can talk about the dwarf fothrgilla. We could talk about some of those zigzag goldenrods and those cool geraniums and winterberry. People forget winterberry is this beautiful native and that we should use it more often. It does get a little large, so you got to give it a little space, but winterberry is a beautiful shrub and it provides a lot of interest and flavor in the garden. So don't be afraid that you can do some of these fun shady things and bring those into the scheme of things in your own rain garden. This is one of my fun things. I did these for a couple villages. And they're just this cute little sample, like what can you put in the space? So this is just a 10-foot diameter space. So probably dealing with maybe one gutter and a little bit of surface runoff. But it just gives you a basic, I'm starting out, I don't know what I'm doing, what can I do? So I just threw some beautiful Asclepias and Carnata in there. One of my favorites is Rattlesnake Master. It's got the coolest form. It's just fun to play with. And then I have some dry things on the edges. I have your prairie smoke, which likes to be a little drier. Some iris in the middle, some beautiful liatris, your mountain mint, which is always fun. Nobody can forget about black-eyed Susan. And then some of your New England asters, which can handle moisture and a little bit dry. So putting those on the edges. But this is what I love, and I want to draw your attention to the bottom, is look how many pollinators love these plants. This is the cool part. You don't have to do a crazy, if we go back to these slides, you don't have to do, this has, I think each of these has like close to 15 plants in them. You don't have to do that. You could, this is just simply, you've got about 8 plants here, and look at the pollinators you're bringing to the site by just a few. You can even cut this in half and do like 4 of these. You could do like the mountain mint and the Rudbeckia and some of the geums on the side and the Asclepias, and you could still bring in all those pollinators. So rain gardens really make a difference. I always tell people that a lot of your rain garden species are those high pollinator species. So it's great to even put something like this, and you just have these, and this includes everything. So this is when I talk about species of pollinators coming to these plants, I'm talking about birds, butterflies, beetles, flies, all those fun things. So everything in between. So, but you're talking about over 300 species. How cool is that? It's one of my favorite things to talk about as far as, so I have these cool samples. I can share these with all of you after the fact, but they're just fun because this is a beautiful, sun rain garden, and what you're doing to help the pollinators is just fantastic. So this is also something I love to do. And if you're like me, I love to look at things and figure things out. So I like to lay it all out, and I'm old school. I like to do spreadsheets and things like that, but I'm a little plant geek like that. But I love, this is just one of the rain gardens that I went through and looking at the species. So its name, what it looks like, when does it bloom, and what does it need? So we were looking at, we had a kind of an area that was sun and shade, a little bit of partial shade. It was kind of southeastern facing. And where do we need to put these things? So moderately wet, wet, how do we site them in the garden? And then how many pollinators that we were bringing with this particular collection. So I really like to spread out. I want to make sure I have blooms. We all love that. We want things to bloom now. And our crocus are just starting to pop through. And I just was walking at the Arboretum yesterday and I saw just a few of their little snowdrops coming up and things like that. So we're always anxious to get something blooming early. But how do we keep that blooming for the pollinators throughout the season? So laying it out and figuring it out, even if you only use 3 of these, how do I get something that starts in May or June and goes till October by only picking 2 or 3 species out? And how can I make the biggest impact? All right, any thoughts about design or questions? And then we'll get into the fun part about installation and maintenance, because that's everybody's question. All right. Design is usually the easiest part to understand because people love just putting plants in the ground and seeing what happens. So installation, this is when it really becomes real. So lay it out, figure it out. You may need a berm or a little bit more complex basin. I've done 2-tiered rain gardens where we've really had a lot of water flow. So we've actually tapered it down. So we've done 1 shelf level and then tapered it down to another so we could slow down the flow of water. But work smarter, not harder. Use a hose. I love that. Everybody's like, you use a hose? Use it to measure it out. Spray pan out your lines. Make it look great. The yardstick method. Go through and just figure out how it can go and measure it all out. Bury your pipes first. Do that. Or have somebody help you do that. If you're burying your downspouts, get them to where you need to go in the rain garden and then start digging. Level the basin. So this is something people forget to do. They think it has to always be sloped. The bottom of the basin really should be level because you want, anytime you get those 2 to 3 inch rains, you want the water to spread evenly out in those wet areas that you're doing that planting. And a lot of times people think, oh, I've got to angle it because the water's got to drain to the other side and have the outflow if I have too much water. Water will find a way. Trust me, it always does. But you really need to level that bottom so you keep that moisture in long enough. When we have those really heavy rains, you're going to have an outlet. And that's the next one. Making sure you have an overflow. It needs to go somewhere that's safe for erosion. When we have those 6-inch rains in 24 hours, your rain garden's going to overflow no matter how big you build it. So making sure you have an outlet where it can overflow safely and you're not dealing with erosion every time it rains. And making sure you're keeping those sides around 60%. They do need a nice kind of steep angle on the sides. Soil, make sure you account for the slopes. You might need some extra soil. You might need to build that up just a little bit. So making sure you have enough soil on hand so when you start digging, you know what to do. And then obviously making sure you site your plants correctly. No, the center is your wettest, the sides you're going to be occasionally, and your berm is going to be the dry area. So making sure you're doing that in a kind of a regular method. But the biggest thing is to remember is to level out your basin, and don't forget you have to have an outlet somewhere. The water has to have some place to go when we get really high rains. So this is the biggest question I get from clients and residents is, what do I do? I planted this beautiful rain garden and now I don't know what to do with it. How do I cover it? How do I care for it? How do I deal with it as it changes? Mulch. You have to have some kind of mulch or cover. We talked about paper. We talked about leaf mulch. You do have to protect those plants right at the beginning because they're going to be cute and small and they're not going to be able to establish, especially if we have those really heavy rains. So you want to make sure they get those roots sunk in. They can start doing what they do as natives. They can sink those roots down deep and establish themselves. So you have to do some kind of help with them those first couple of years. Plant for overlap and competition. This is where everybody looks at me like, why are you telling me to plant plants that are going to die in a couple of years? You want some overlap. You want some natural competition. The rain garden, as it settles in over time, is going to figure out what it needs. You can design the best rain garden in the world and it's going to say, I'm Mother Nature and I'm always going to win. So making sure you're planting for a little bit of that overlap where some are a little bit more moist loving, some are a little bit drier, and they're going to compete well together. So look at the root structures that you have on those plant materials. If you do plant shrubs, where are they competing? How are they competing? Making sure you're planting for a little bit of overlap and then watch it. See what it does as it goes over time. always check your inlet or your outlet for erosion. It's going to happen. Whether we have a downspout that gets stuck and then it blasts through and then suddenly shoots out a bunch of water, whether a downspout gets stuck and you don't have as much water going to that rain garden that you thought you did, and plants are starting to dry out and you just don't notice it for several weeks. So making sure you're checking those regularly. It's like anything you do in your garden. You got to check it to see if everything's going over time. And don't forget to clean out your downspouts. That is important. A lot of times I recommend people put traps or inlets in so they can easily clean out any of the debris that goes in there. Because if those get clogged, that totally changes the dynamics of your rain garden. I'm sorry to say that you will always have to weed. But plant and plan for just a little. That's where that overlap and competition comes into hand. Weeding is always going to happen because you're going to have a moist environment. So those weed seeds are going to blow in from wherever they decide to blow in, and they're going to take hold because it's moist. But making sure you have enough competition and that you're not dealing with it constantly. Cutting back, always cut back in the spring for rain gardens. I know a lot of people like to cut back in the fall because it's clean and they can mulch it up and leave it on their beds for winter, which is a great idea, but try to hold off until the spring for rain gardens. The reason being we have freeze and thaw, as we all know. And when we have freeze and thaw, we have some of that shifting of soil and erosion. So the more debris that you can keep on there, the better. So when we do have those gushing early spring rains, like we sometimes do, that material is still on there and it's holding the plants better in place. So you not have some of those erosion issues. So try to cut back in the spring. You can still mulch up the debris and keep it as kind of leaf mulch on site, but try to hold off. That's the one thing. I don't care if you do fall or spring. Spring always has its benefits, as I say. I leave most of my stuff up till spring. But for rain gardens, there's a little bit of extra benefit there. Ignoring, editing, and removing. This is where people have a hard time. They don't want to take out plants, but you have to edit and remove in a rain garden. You have this beautiful, perfect environment where you have moisture and you have movement and you have native plants self-seeding and doing their own thing. So you may ignore some things. You may ignore that the design shifts over time. You may remove a few things that are kind of taking over the world. You may edit a few things. So ignoring, editing, and removing is one of my favorite things for management. I don't call it maintenance, I call it management. You're managing what Mother Nature's doing on her own. So ignoring a few things could be okay. And then taking out a few things, move it to another spot in the garden, give it to a neighbor or a friend, but don't be afraid to take stuff out if it's really hurting the whole dynamic of the ecosystem that you're creating. This is one of my favorite things to do. Don't forget to add things. You're going to bring pollinators to the site. You're going to bring these beautiful things that are happening in your garden. So don't forget to add some of those fun things in your garden, like birdhouses or nesting boxes, benches, so you can actually enjoy it. And hummingbird feeders. You're going to have all these new pollinators coming around. So you're going to have things that are going to enjoy this space. And you're not going to have ever standing water, but you're going to have that moisture for that little bit of time. And birds and hummingbirds love that. So enjoy the space and kind of cultivate that ecosystem. And then the biggest thing with rain gardens, and we touched on it earlier, is be flexible and change. Monitor and adapt. The rain garden's going to change over time. Like I said, rain gardens that I built 10 years ago, we did for 1-inch rains because that's what most of the time we had to deal with. And now we're talking about 2- and 3-inch rains as a standard. Even the National Weather Service is saying we should look at 2-inch storm events as the norm, or even 3. They're actually talking about pushing to 2.5 or 3 now nationwide. So it's really fun to say, what did my rain garden look like 10 years ago? And now what does it need to look like? So be flexible. See how it changes over time. Look at those moisture spots. Take your umbrella or your raincoat and go outside in the rain and see where there's standing water. It's really fascinating. I actually did that when I first installed my rain garden. And I have a great video, and I should actually include it on this, but it's a great video of the water like pouring into my rain garden and seeing where it went and how it went. And it was really fun to actually go out there in a gushing rain. I'm sure I looked crazy and my husband thought I was silly, but he actually thought it was really cool too. So seeing those things and being able to adapt to what your rain garden needs over time. And if you do need to expand it and how you need to deal with it. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This is a beautiful sketch, again, from the Farmer's Almanac. I love it. But it just shows this is what a rain garden can look like. And this is all our dream. We want this beautiful, it's kind of in the front yard. It's taking all these things. You see the birds and the butterflies, and this is our dream, but it can be a reality. It's not so far-fetched. It's just a matter of planning and understanding the stages that you need to go to make sure you're going through that process of form and function and beauty. It's not just about one or the other, it's about all three. So I guess, where are we with questions?
Well, I have another comment about digging the rain garden and creating
Yes.
the berm around the outside. When, you know, you're digging up a lot of, you have all this turf, assuming
Yes.
that you're putting it in your lawn. And so when my son dug my rain garden, he just sliced off the top layer of sod, you know, like he was removing sod, and he turned it upside down and built a berm with that. And then of course you don't want it to sprout, you don't want it to keep growing. So he took, you know, like those, you know, heavy landscape cloths, you know, the black stuff, and he put it all, you know, he weighted it down with rocks, and I don't know how long we left it on there, a couple of weeks, until it stopped showing that there was any grass growing out of it. And then it was kind of ready to be planted into, you know. So that was another kind of do-it-yourself idea that we came up with along
Yes,
the way.
if you have a small rain garden, it's a great method to flip the soil, making sure you're killing out those sprouts before you try to plant in it, and using just people use like the heavy duty. I use the heavy duty black like trash bags for lawn debris, because I don't put my lawn debris in trash bags. I put it in my compost pile, but I cut apart those bags and I use them as the cover surface. So that's a great option. Or even using pond liner. Pond liner is a great reusable resource. It's expensive up front, but then you can move it around your garden as you're doing stuff. But it really kills stuff quickly. You can have pond liner on an area for even just a week or two in the summer, and it'll kill everything underneath. Even that beautiful creeping Charlie that we all love and hate. So that's a great method. If you're looking at a larger area for a rain garden, I don't like to use spray, but in some instances you can use a spray and leave the turf on site. Some of your foliar sprays, when you're just talking about lawn spray, has a very short shelf life. So you're not having any runoff issues. You're not having any kind of dispersion in the garden that people are scared of when they talk about herbicides or things like that. So that is an option. But if you can do the turf and flip method, if you have a smaller space, it's definitely an easy way to go, because you're keeping all that nitrogen that's heavy in that bluegrass that we have in our lawn, and you're keeping it right on site. So it's beautiful just to dig a little small hole, plant that native plant in there, and the native plant's just going to take off and be really happy because you're keeping that organic material on the site as opposed to hauling it away.
There are some questions in the chat window. I wonder, Rich.
Sure.
Yeah, one question that Anna asks, how late can you wait in the spring to do that cleanup on your rain garden? The current concern being all the insects that have overwintered in all of that material.
Yes, that's why I wait till spring.
How late?
You can wait a long time. Purposely or not purposely. I've actually seen crews out already, and I'm like, it's way too early. So please don't clean out your stuff right now. I usually wait until easily mid-April. I may clean up a few things early. Some of the things I clean up early are things like my hellebores, because obviously they're already coming through the soil right now. So I clean up some of those early pushing plants. So hellebores, my GM usually comes out pretty early, my prairie smoke. So I might rake a little bit and clean up, but I leave a lot of my late sprouters, like that you usually see in mid-May or June, as long as I possibly can. because you do have those wonderful beetles that live in there. You have some bees that hang out in some of those areas, and you want to try to leave them as long as possible. I know people are like, oh my gosh, why hasn't she cleaned up her yard? But it's the best thing you can do, and it actually protects those plants a lot longer, because we don't need to mulch right away. Most of our things are warm season, and they actually like being mulched closer to June or even July. I've had people mulch right before the 4th of July, and that's actually a really great time to do it, because it's usually before we get those hot summer days where that mulch is really needed. So it's okay to wait as long as possible. That's a great question.
James asked an interesting question. Concern is drought. This winter we haven't had as much moisture as usual. And what happens when we have an extended period of dry period? What does that do to your rain garden? And should you be putting a hose on there or what?
That is a great question, James. I have only watered, my rain garden's been in probably 5 years. I have a beautiful sloped driveway. You literally come down my driveway into my garage. And so my rain garden serves a purpose of collecting all that beautiful road water and my driveway water. And so when we don't have rain, my rain garden gets pretty dry. I think since it's been installed for about 5 years, I think I've watered it, besides initial establishment, which you do need to water at initial establishment, of course. I think I've watered it twice. Once was a couple of years ago when we had that, I think it was 12 weeks of dry. I threw water on it a couple times. But like I said earlier, you can adapt to it. Your rain garden, some of those really wet species are going to dry out and they might die. And some of those more drier species might start creeping down into your rain garden and self-seeding. So you can let Mother Nature take its course, or give it a little bit of supplemental water. We know we have some kind of climate change. Whatever you believe is going on, our climate is changing. And so we know things are going to be adapting and changing. So, if you don't want to put a hose on it every year, then let some of those drier species creep in a little further into that slope, and leave those more moderate species in the middle. So let it adapt on its own. If you're really concerned about it, then you can supplemental water if you're trying to keep hold of some of those really cool moisture plants that we all love. But yeah, it is a big challenge that we didn't get. Everybody's like, oh, our winter was great. I'm like, yeah, but we really need more moisture. People get excited when it doesn't snow as much. And I'm like, no, we really need the snow. So that is, watch it adapt, see where that plants really go out during a rain, and seeing where those high intensity moisture areas is. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a slope. You might have this irregular kind of bean shape in the middle of your rain garden, because that's where the moisture holds, and the stuff on the edges is really drying out during those drought periods. So I don't know if that helps, James. It's kind of a roundabout way to answer the question, but it's one of those things you just kind of have to watch and wait. And if you're really okay with watering it a couple times a year, then go for it. If you really don't want to mess with watering it a couple times a year, then start seeing where those areas are where you can adapt and change.
Francis wonders if you can use a rain barrel in conjunction with your rain garden.
Of course you can. Great question. Rain barrels can definitely be in conjunction with a rain garden. How you figure that one out is don't really add a lot of excess moisture to that, because a lot of times our rain gardens, we're sizing for 2 to 3 inch rain. Your rain barrel is going to fill up. Usually rain barrels fill up in a 1 inch rain, unless we're using them a lot. And they're going to have the overflow valve, which we all know. So when that rain barrel fills up to the top and it's full and it has the overflow can go right into a rain garden. It's a perfect space for it. So when we have those really drenching rains, you can add that extra moisture to your rain garden. As far as sizing goes, you might just expand it just slightly. 1 rain barrel is really not going to make a difference. I've had clients that have put together 3 or 4 rain barrels. Then you're going to want to think about, it's not really going to have a lot of excess water coming into the rain garden. But in those big rains, it will. So, but you don't need to necessarily size for it. But if you have just 1 rain barrel, consider it's going to take about half of that rainwater most of the time. So yeah, rain barrels, that way you have that excess water when you need it. Rain barrels are perfect with rain gardens.
Question from Susan about that photo that you have on the display on the screen right now. That yellow.
It's yellow.
What is that? The yellow bush.
That's actually supposed to be a honeysuckle. So that's supposed to be one of our, not our bad honeysuckles, our good honeysuckles. So that's supposed to be one of our bush honeysuckles back here in the back. Probably a little illustrative license there, but that's what that's supposed to be, yes.
There's a question about swales. Is that different than a rain garden, a swale?
On paper, yes. Functionally, no. So a swale is actually directing water to a place. So you're basically stretching out your rain garden. So most of the time swales are a little shallower. So when you're talking about a 6-inch rain garden, you're probably talking about closer to a 4-inch swale. So something that's a little, and you're narrowing where that water's going. So you're just giving it more of a channel as opposed to a basin. So it's giving a pitch, you're moving water through the space, it's infiltrating as it goes around. You're directing the water. So sometimes people do, I would say probably my rain garden is more of a swale because it goes down my slope on the side of my driveway, but I'm directing water to the bottom basin and ultimately into a tributary of the DuPage River. So I'm cleaning the water as it goes. So mine's probably more of a rain garden swale as well. It's more about the shape. Functionally, they function a little different. In a swale, you're not going to have those heavy moisture plants because the water is going to be moving, especially when we get 3-inch rains at a faster rate. So you're not going to get that infiltration that you're looking for. So you're going to want to stay on the dry to moderate. So most of your swale plants are going to be dry to moderate for sure. Whereas a rain garden, you can have more of those more moisture loving species. So yes, swales are different because they're conveying water. You're trying to move water from place to place, whereas a rain garden, you're really trying to keep it in one location and infiltrate it. Not that swales don't do that, but they're also conveying water to a different location.
Yeah, swales, my take on swales is the surface runoff that gets redirected, whereas the rain garden is where it stops and soaks in.
Yes, so you may use a swale to get it to an eventual rain garden. That's kind of how mine works. I get it off the driveway and into a space and a basin. So you may utilize a swale to move that, but remember your swale is going to take on a drier format. So don't try to put like beautiful moisture, wet loving plants in there because they're not going to be happy. Great questions.
There's no more questions in the chat, but maybe somebody would like to unmute themselves and just verbally ask a question.
Always.
Or not.
You are very quiet.
Hopefully I didn't put you to sleep. Hopefully you learned at least one new thing tonight. That's what I always strive to do, that you at least found something you could take away and use for yourself. But thank you. I really appreciate you having me. And yeah, ask any questions. I'm always here to help.
I have a comment on something that bugs me, and that's water retention areas that you see throughout the suburbs, which are deep swimming pool shaped areas, mostly of lawn grass. And they have an inlet and an outlet usually, and they'll fill up when there's heavy rains, and then they'll drain over time. How come these aren't just giant rain gardens? And wouldn't it be more effective to have rain garden type plants in those areas? And maybe they don't have to be so large. Yes.
Yes to all. Yeah, it's something that a lot of villages are looking at because it's a high maintenance to mow that lawn all the time, and then half the time they can't get in there with their lawn mowers because of moisture. Big surprise. It's a high maintenance effort for villages that are in associations that have these detention areas. They're not really detention areas, they're retention areas. The water basically comes, they think it's magically going to get permeated through turf grass, which we know turf grass has roots that are about not even 2.5, 3 inches. So it's not going to soak up anything. They're going to soak up what little moisture they need, and then they're going to dump the rest out the outlet. So yes, it would be the biggest thing that we've had trouble with these more, what I would call like public areas, is we thought we could throw some seed down many years ago, and then nobody maintained it. And so it got weedy, and people are like, just mow it all down and get rid of it and put turf grass in because it looks ugly and we don't know what to do with it. That was kind of the age of stormwater management. We knew we had to dig these basins. We were building subdivisions. We were building larger retail areas, and we knew the water had to go somewhere, but we didn't know what to do with it. Now we know a lot more. We know that natives are beautiful and that we can maintain them in a beautiful way. And so we're just now starting to see, I would say, I probably had 5 or 6 phone calls with different places last year saying, please come and help me with my retention basin. So we're just starting to see people warm up to the idea that I can throw natives back in there. They can be beautiful and they can get more of those retention effects. So we're not overloading the stormwater systems. But it is a simple palette. It's not something crazy like what you're going to put in your backyard with 10 different varieties. It might be a 2 or 3 variety retention basin. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. It needs to be very simple, easy to maintain, and it's going to look beautiful. So I think we're over adding more complexity than we need to some of those things. It doesn't have to be anything really complex, but it needs to be more than turf grass.
Well, that brings to mind Jan Smith Park. Jan Smith is online with us, and she created a native planting in a retention basin that's in a public park.
Wonderful.
In Jan Smith, Carol Stream actually named the park after Jan Smith.
Yay.
And she got some awards for it, and it's beautiful. And in June, we're going to have a work day where we go and do some weeding. It's a big space. I mean, she's only planted, I think the park, Jan can correct me, but it's like there's a 4-acre area, and she's planted natives in one small part of that. But it takes maintenance, and so that's going to be one of our projects. Go to help her out a couple of times this summer, and work together. It's fun, you know. And
you can't eliminate weeding altogether, but it only takes a touch once or twice, and you've got to do it at the beginning of that establishment, because if you don't, then those plants don't have a chance. Once the weeds get out, then it is a more simple process. Not to say you can't just walk away from it and never touch it again, but it can be a more simple process where you're weeding a couple times a year and the plants have really taken establishment. And it creates such a more beautiful space than turf grass.
Oh yes, definitely.
But I would like to say something I've been thinking about, Ms. Arnold. There is a potential change coming up, and I don't know if it is going to happen or not, but a development right in the property next to the park wants to solve their runoff problem. And this is preliminary, and there's more to be planned, but they're talking about, well, you said there has to be an inlet and an outlet. And right now there are 2 outlets that are, drains in the bottom of the detention, or, well, in the bottom of it, that go somewhere, I think, to another area where there's retention.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about taking those drains out, but making part of that low basin 3 feet deeper. And I just wonder, what's going to happen? Is it going to become a lake, or is it going?
It's going to be becoming more of a detention basin as opposed to a retention basin. There's probably going to be water in there most of the time. And unless they actually plant the sides, then you're going to have a beautiful place for Canadian geese just to have at it and terrorize the place. So yeah, that's a concern. Deeper is not always better. Wider is better, but obviously space limitations. But yeah, that sounds more like a pond. That sounds like they're talking about more detention as opposed to retention.
Well, I need to feel like I would like to refer someone like you to the planning
Say,
process.
please don't dig a big pit.
Don't dig a big pit. Yes, it's, are you available, or can I write down?
Yes, please do. Please reach
number?
out.
I mean, to consult, it seems to me like you
Yeah,
know.
because if they're doing something like that, that could greatly affect the park as far as what's happening and what's going on next to it.
Don't they use that for baseball sometimes, Jan?
They
There won't
used
be-
to have football practice in there.
Oh.
They don't really do much of anything with the higher end of the park.
Okay.
But the areas that I worked on for planting are on the top of the berm.
Mhm.
Hmm.
They're not, but they, after a while, they had so much trouble, like you said, with getting stuck when they tried to mow. So the park district on their own decided to not mow it anymore
Mhm.
and just let it grow. And so we've tried to put some natives in there too. But it is kind of a mess. I mean, to me, it is. It isn't what my dream would be for it to be. But I am really grateful for the help from the wild ones coming out and helping weed on the berm. And last year they did a lot of help in the basin, digging out some, let's see, teasel. I've been trying to keep the teasel from spreading.
Mhm. That's
So-
always a fun weed in our area.
Yeah, and we've limited it pretty much, but there are always seeds, you know. So I know.
Right.
Anyway,
Well,
I'm just
Amanda-
concerned about
Yeah.
them having the right kind of expertise. Sounds like a big engineering project to me. If it goes through, I don't know if this is what will happen, but if it goes through, that they will use part of it for retention or detention from the neighboring property,
Yeah.
which now has a really old barn on it and a couple farmhouses, but they do want to develop, somebody wants to develop it into
Well, we will be in touch on that. I just want Amanda's phone number and website are on the screen right now, Jan, if you want to jot that down.
yeah, I got the phone number.
Okay.
Maybe I can take a picture of the
Yeah, my email is just amanda@planit.land.
So I just want to remind the people that are still online, I think we've lost a few people, but next month we're going to be learning about how to attract butterflies to, I mean, not butterflies, hummingbirds. Hummingbirds to your yard. So David Kanya is a bird person, and he's going to concentrate on hummingbirds, and they're so beautiful. I'm looking forward to that.
Wonderful.
And so I think we've covered all the questions that people had.
I think so. I was just looking at the chat
Complimentary-
box.
Lots of complimentary
Thank you.
comments in the chat window. Everything, I think.
Thank you so
you
much.
enjoyed this, Amanda.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me this evening. It's fun to talk about water. It's the one thing that everybody has problems with because water will go wherever water wants to go.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I guess we can bring the meeting to a close now. And
Thanks, everyone.
hope we see you again
you.
soon.